In this video lesson, we'll discuss the rising tension over slavery and the impact of the Kansas-Nebraska Act on bleeding Kansas. Sectional tensions were further strained in 1852. Harriet Beecher Stowe, a wisp of a woman and a mother of a half-dozen children, published her novel titled Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. Dismayed by the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, she was determined to awaken the North to the wickedness of slavery, especially the cruel splitting up of families of slaves for selling. Her wildly popular book relied on powerful imagery. The deeper sources of her anti-slavery sentiments lay in the evangelical religious crusades of the Second Great Awakening. Totals of books sold soon ran into the millions as the tale was translated into many languages. No other novel in American history can be compared with it as a political force. To millions of people, Uncle Tom's Cabin made slavery appear almost as evil as it really was, and the truth is that it did help start the Civil War, and help win the Civil War as well. Southerners criticized her unfair indictment as Mrs. Stowe had never witnessed slavery at first hand in the Deep South, but she had seen slavery during a visit to Kentucky, where she'd lived for many years in Ohio, and which was a center of Underground Railroad activity. Uncle Tom left a profound impression on the North. Readers swore to have nothing to do with the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law. The tale was devoured by millions of impressionable youths in 1850s, some of whom will fight in the Civil War. The novel was immensely popular abroad, especially in Britain and France. When the Civil War started, and the people of England sensed that the triumph of the North would spell the end of the Black Curse. Governments in London and Paris considered intervening for the South, but they realized that many of their own people would not support them. Another trouble-brewing book appeared in 1857, 5 years after the debut of Uncle Tom. The Impending Crisis of the South, written by Hinton Helper, a non-aristocratic white from North Carolina, attempted to prove by statistics that indirectly the non-slaveholding whites were the ones who suffered most from the millstone of slavery. Helper's influence was negligible among the poorer whites to whom he addressed his message. His book was banned in the South, where book-burning parties were held. In the North, thousands of copies were distributed as campaign literature by the Republicans. Southerners were further embittered. The North-South contest for Kansas continues. Kansas provided an example of the worst possible workings of popular sovereignty. Newcomers who ventured into Kansas were a motley lot. Most of the Northerners were just ordinary westward-moving pioneers in search of richer lands. A small part of the inflow was financed by groups of Northern abolitionists or free soilers, like the New England Immigration Aid Company. People were sent to the troubled areas to forestall the South and to make a profit. Southern spokesmen raised furious cries of betrayal. They had supported the Kansas-Nebraska scheme of Douglas with the unspoken understanding that Kansas would become slave and Nebraska would become free. Nebraskans were trying to abolitionize Kansas. A few Southern hotheads attempted to assist small groups of well-armed slave owners to Kansas, but planting slaves in Kansas was a losing game. Slaves were valuable and volatile property, and foolish indeed were owners who would take them with bullets where bullets were flying and where soil might be free. Crisis conditions in Kansas rapidly worsened. When the day came in 1855 to elect members of the first territorial legislature, pro-slavery border ruffians poured in from Missouri to vote early and often. Slavery supporters triumphed and set up their puppet government at Shawnee Mission, and the Free Soilers established a regime in Topeka. The confused Kansans thus had their choice between two governments, one based in fraud, the other in illegality. Tensions mounted as settlers fueled over conflicting land claims. The breaking point came in 1856 when a gang of pro-slavery raiders, alleging provocation, shot up and burned a part of the free soil town of Lawrence. This outrage was but the prelude to a bloodier tragedy. The fanatical figure of John Brown now stalked upon the Kansas battlefield. He was obsessively dedicated to the abolitionist cause and was becoming involved in dubious dealings. He moved from Kansas from Ohio with a part of his large family. Brooding over the recent attack on Lawrence, Old Brown of Osawatomie led a band of his followers to Pottawatomie Creek in May of 1856. There they literally hacked to pieces 5 surprised men, presumed to be pro-slavery, and this butcher tainted the Free Soil cause and brought vicious retaliation from the pro-slavery forces. Civil war in Kansas, which thus flared up in 1856, continued intermittently until it merged with the large-scale Civil War of 1861 to 1865, which is going to paralyze agriculture. By 1857, Kansas had enough people, chiefly Free Soilers, to apply for statehood on a popular sovereignty basis. The pro-slavery forces devised the Lecompton Constitution. The people were not allowed to vote for or against the Constitution as a whole, but for the Constitution with slavery or with no slavery. If they voted against slavery, one of the provisions of the Constitution would protect the owners of slaves already in Kansas. So whatever the outcome, there would still be black bondage in Kansas. Many Free Soilers, infuriated by this play, boycotted the polls. Left to themselves, the pro-slaveryites approved the Constitution with slavery late in 1857. The scene that next shifted to Washington, where President Pierce had been succeeded by James Buchanan, who was also strongly under the Southern influence. Buchanan was blind to sharp divisions within his own Democratic Party, and he threw the weight of his administration behind the Southern-promoted Lecompton Constitution. But Senator Douglas, who had championed true popular sovereignty, fought for fair play and democratic principles. The outcome was a compromise that submitted the entire Lecompton Constitution to a popular vote. The Free Soil voters overwhelmed the polls and snowed it under. Kansas remained a territory until 1861, when the Southern secessionists left Congress. President Buchanan, by antagonizing the numerous Douglas Democrats in the North, divided the once powerful Democratic Party. It had been the only remaining national party because the Whigs were dead and the Republicans were merely a sectional party. Bleeding Kansas also spattered blood on the floor of the Senate in 1856. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts was a leading abolitionist, highly educated, but he had made himself one of the most disliked men in the Senate. Brooding over the issue of popular sovereignty, he wrote a blistering speech titled "The Crime Against Kansas." Sumner condemned the pro-slavery men and referred to South Carolina and to Senator Andrew Butler, one of the best-liked men in the Senate. Hot-tempered Congressman Preston S. Brooks of South Carolina now took the issue into his own hands because he resented the insults to his state and senator. His code of honor called for a duel, but in the South, one fought only with one's social equal, so the only alternative was to chastise the senator through violence. On May 22, 1856, he approached Sumner and pounded the speaker with an 11-ounce cane until it broke, and the victim fell bleeding and unconscious to the floor. The House of Representatives could not muster enough votes to expel the South Carolinian, but he resigned and was triumphantly reelected, with Southern admirers sending him canes. The injuries to Sumner's head and nervous system were serious. He was forced to leave his state for 3.5 years and go to Europe for painful and costly treatment. Meanwhile, Massachusetts defiantly reelected him, leaving his seat empty. Bleeding Sumner was joined with Bleeding Kansas as a political issue. The Free Soil North was against the bully Brooks, and copies of Sumner's abusive speech were sold by the tens of thousands, earning Republican votes. The South was angered not only because Sumner had made a speech, but also because it had been so applauded in the North. The Sumner-Brooks clash and the reactions revealed how dangerously inflamed passions were becoming in the U.S. Arguably, this was one of the first blows of the Civil War. And we'll continue to discuss John Brown and his impact on Bleeding Kansas and the violence in the Senate in our lessons in class.